Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Miles Harvey and focus on video games and education. And today I really just wanted to go over a few questions that I get on a regular basis that it would be nice to have some reference with. So the first question is, how are video games educational? And that's a pretty understandable question coming from the idea that video games have been around a long time, and at the beginning they weren't necessarily very complex, but things have changed, and since the 1970s up till now, we have technologies like augmented and virtual reality console gaming experiences, and things have really evolved, and things are much more complex than they've ever been before. And so looking at video games in particular in education, it's a good hotspot because we know that students are using a lot of these technologies at home, but very few of those technologies are making their way into the classroom. So there's this gap between what's being used at home and what's being used at school, and it's important that we train our students in school to work with technology. And so um, the cool part is video games are full of rich learning experiences, and I'm not talking about the simple, you know, edutainment games. I'm talking about AAA games that students play on a regular basis at home have a lot of embedded learning in them, or what extra credits would call tangential learning. There is learning to be found and made meaning from in the games if students play them. And a lot of those games, BioShock, The Last of Us, Uncharted series, we could make another video on games that are appropriate. But the argument is that video games are rich places to learn. There are affinity spaces, as James G. talks about, that students learn from and associate with on top of their experience playing the game. Playing games is, a very social thing. In my dissertation research, I found that was I think it was like 12 or 14% of what the data came from my studies showed that students were very social playing. They like to collaborate and talk and backseat game and all that. So the idea is, how are games educational? Well, you have to be able to find within the medium of games what is beneficial to your curriculum. There's not a map out there that says, hey, use this. The idea is that somebody who is specialized in a discipline can go out into the gaming world and find things that would help students in their classroom in that discipline. So if playing BioShock as a science teacher was something of interest to you, then you could add a little piece of that into your curriculum. Um, for language arts teachers, video games are some of the most elaborate stories um, ever to experience. And so to be able to take the agency of a player and to play in that domain, rather than just be a reader being guided by the author or the authority of the text, is something different. And kids like to have agency over their narrative experiences, and so it's nice to see video games and virtual reality, augmented reality, these technologies slowly coming to the classroom. But the question is, how do we do that? And those can be, for a later video, some strategies. But video games, and literacy have been an accepted kind of thing of the past. I think even in 2007, James G. wrote his book, and plenty of people like Squire and Steinkuhler and Penske and Holden, and I mean, just to name a few class, these people have been studying game-based learning in context and understanding a lot about what's going on. The idea, though, is how do we get it into the classroom? A lot of good ideas, not a lot of practical solutions. That's what my dissertation was kind of based off of, providing that real-world example of games in place. Another question I get, is how do you organize your year now that you have a class to teach media literacy in games? And so what do you do in a whole year? It's honestly just like teaching a language arts class, but using a lot more technology as mediums, and we're looking at software, we're looking at games, we're looking at virtual reality, we're coding. I'm able to design a year that's kind of based around, um, well, it's almost the semiotic domains of each little specific medium we're using, and if that's coding, then we're on code.org, and we're playing games and designing games with our code in code.org, and we're building digital literacy, and um, a lot of this stuff stretches out the whole year. And so it's pretty easy to spend an hour a day, 180 days with students, talking about video games and playing video games and coding and designing video games and talking about all the extra stuff that's embedded within all of that, character analysis, motive, theme, all this literary stuff that I hear teachers go, well, I don't play games, how am I supposed to teach with games? And I get it. That leads me to another good question: is if you haven't played games before, how are you supposed to treat them like literature in a classroom if you haven't ever played? And I say get out there and play some of the old stuff. Dig around the house and find consoles that you're not using anymore or have been put in a closet. Take them out, play them, and think about the fact that your training as a language arts teacher, an experience maker, is that you are really treating video games in the very paralleled way you treat a book. We're looking at the narrative, we're looking at the plot and the evolution, motive, we're looking at character analysis and the protagonist and the rising action and the decisions. And a lot of good games are written with such complexity that it rivals many great stories in the way that they're experienced. And so we have to give kids at least the chance to do that in school every now and again, let's say for language arts. And we could go on with examples for many of the other disciplines with many other different technologies. But the idea is if you've never used games before, that's okay, because you're trained in many other things that adopt a lot of the same attributes you need to teach video games. And so if you have a little bit of courage and faith, you can feel a little bit more comfortable employing video games or just any type of technology experience like VR, AR in your classroom if you set it up right. The idea is that students have the proper literary appetite. They want to play on the phone, but they also want to read a book. They want to go home and help mom with the car manual and change, I don't know, something, or they want to help in the kitchen and cook, and they need to read the recipes. The types of literacies kids need to have in their life is beginning to change, we can see that. It's the game players of the 70s, 80s, and 90s who are now teaching. And so the average age of a teacher is like 41, 42, I believe, and in America, and the average age of a video game player is like 36, 37. So we're reaching this point where naturally our influences with technology are coming into the profession of teaching. And so I want people to prepare to be blown away by the usefulness that these technologies can bring with a little bit of change to how we do things now.